What happens when a billionaire known for his cold ambition meets a woman who refuses to bend even when her world is falling apart? On a snow-choked highway in the Midwest, Garrett Whitaker's life collides with Evelyn Harper's. He is a man the media calls ruthless, a CEO fighting to protect his empire. She is a secretary carrying the weight of her sick niece, an aging father, and bills stacked higher than hope. One stormy night, their paths cross, and neither of them walks away unchanged. But can a man who has spent years chasing profit learn what it means to choose people over power? Can a woman who has built her life on pride and boundaries allow herself to trust again between boardroom scandals, whispered betrayals, and the fragile heartbeat of a child? They are pushed to the edge of choices that will define not only their futures, but the meaning of love itself. Will Eve keep rejecting his advances forever, or will Garrett's fifth attempt finally melt the walls she built around her soul? If you believe in stories of resilience, healing, and unexpected love, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. Snow slashed across the windshield like knives of glass, each gust of wind shaking the heavy SUV as if it were nothing more than a tin toy. Garrett Whitaker tightened his grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenched as red hazard lights flickered through the white haze. All around him, cars stood frozen in a jagged line across Interstate 94. Engines idled, exhaust plumes drifted into the storm, horns blared in frustration. The storm had swallowed the road whole, and now it seemed to hold them hostage. His driver cursed under his breath, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. "Pile up ahead, sir. We're boxed in." Garrett barely listened. His eyes, trained by years of watching details in boardrooms, caught movement outside the fogged window. Through the swirling snow, he saw her slim shoulders hunched against the gale, hair plastered wet against her face, her arms wrapped protectively around a little girl. She guided an elderly man toward the concrete barrier, her boots sinking deep in the snowdrift. She wasn't panicking. Instead, she barked short, clear orders to strangers, telling one man to pass blankets down the line, another to boil water on a camping stove. People listened. For a moment, Garrett thought he must be mistaken. Who organizes strangers in the middle of a highway storm? Yet there she was, steady as stone, her breath visible clouds in the frigid night, her voice calm against the chaos. Something in his chest tightened. Without thinking, Garrett opened the door. The wind slammed into him, stealing his breath with its icy fists. Snow bit at his cheeks as he stepped down. His driver called after him, but Garrett ignored it. His expensive coat whipped around his legs as he trudged through the drifts, following the sound of her voice. "Keep her close to the barrier." "Away from the wind," she called, crouching to adjust the girl's scarf. The girl, tiny, pale, clutching a faded pink backpack, blinked up at Garrett with wide eyes. She leaned into the woman, who held her steady with one arm. The woman glanced up then, meeting Garrett's eyes for the first time. No recognition flickered there, no sign that she cared he was one of the Midwest's most talked-about millionaires. Instead, her look was brisk, assessing, almost challenging. "Don't just stand there," she said firmly. "Help us get these blankets around the older folks. They're shaking." Garrett almost smiled at the command. People rarely spoke to him that way. But he obeyed, taking a stack of blankets from the trunk of a nearby pickup and passing them down the line. The storm howled, but for a brief stretch of time, the chaos felt organized. She moved like she'd done this before, Garrett noticed. She instructed drivers to switch off engines to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning, then urged them to rotate watch over the elderly passengers. When a man slipped in the snow, she was there in an instant, steadying him, her small frame belying her strength. The girl, her daughter, Garrett assumed clung close to her side. The child's lips trembled, not only from cold, but from fear. The woman bent low, pressing her forehead gently against the girl's. "Almost safe. Sweetheart, stay strong for me." The storm roared around them, yet in that tiny moment, Garrett felt the world pause. His phone buzzed angrily in his pocket. Reluctantly, he pulled it free. A flood of messages filled the screen: PR team updates, investor alerts, a subject line flashing in all caps, Harrington Rail reviewing withdrawal, concerns over CEO's unstable personal image. Garrett's stomach sank. The deal he had chased for 2 years, the one that would cement Whitaker Holdings as a national powerhouse, was teetering on the edge because of whispers about his private life. Another gust rattled the SUV. He looked back across the storm, at the woman lifting the little girl onto her hip, trudging against the wind. Snow clung to her lashes. The child buried her face in her neck, trusting her completely. Garrett's throat tightened in a way business losses had never caused. Stability, he thought bitterly. The board wanted the kind that looked good in glossy magazines' charity galas, stage smiles, a spotless partner by his side. But here, in the raw edge of a Wisconsin blizzard, he was watching a different kind of stability, one born from courage and devotion, not image. The wail of sirens finally cut through the night. Emergency lights glowed faint through the curtain of snow. Relief rippled down the stranded line of cars as first responders arrived, ushering the most vulnerable into heated vans. The woman pressed a small wool blanket into Garrett's arms without hesitation. "Hold this. Keep it dry," she said, not waiting for thanks, before turning to check on another shivering passenger. Garrett looked down at the blanket, its coarse fibers already warming his gloves. For a man who owned fleets of trucks and towers of steel, it was the strangest token he had ever held. When the last of the injured were escorted away, Garrett returned to his SUV. His driver asked if he was all right, but Garrett only nodded. He sank into the leather seat. The noise of the storm muffled again by tinted glass. In his hand, he still held the blanket she had given him. He tightened his grip around it, staring out at the blur of red hazard lights and white snow. One question echoed in his mind, stubborn as the storm outside. Who was she by morning? The storm had quieted, leaving behind a landscape of snow piled high along the freeway. Tow trucks and plows moved like beetles across the ice, clearing the wreckage. For most, the night on I-94 faded into another winter story to tell over coffee. But for Garrett Whitaker, the image of the woman in the storm lingered like a spark he could not shake. Back in Chicago, his life resumed its rigid schedule. The penthouse on the river gleamed with glass walls that reflected the frozen cityscape. His mornings began with black coffee delivered by staff, followed by meetings stacked one after another. Spreadsheets filled the screens in his office. Analysts talked of mergers, logistics, and profit margins. PR managers circled him with constant reminders of image management. And yet, through all the noise, his past refused to stay quiet. 2 years earlier, a breakup with Veronica Hale had exploded across tabloids. She had painted him as cold, arrogant, incapable of loyalty. The stain of that scandal clung like smoke he couldn't wash off. Investors tolerated it only because of his brilliance in business. But for Harrington Rail, an old guard company rooted in tradition, the whispers of instability were dangerous. Their chairman, Charles Harrington, prized not just balance sheets but family reputation. Now, PR memos arrived in Garrett's inbox almost hourly. Find a softer presence at public events. Repair image. Stability matters. Stability. The word had begun to feel like a threat. Miles away on the south side, life for Evelyn Harper could not have been more different. Her apartment was small, the paint fading at the edges, the radiator clanking unevenly in the corner. On the kitchen table sat a stack of Bill's medical statements, overdue utility notices, and grocery receipts clipped together with rubber bands. Eve kept a folder of coupons, carefully arranged by date and category. Every dollar had to stretch. Her father, Hank, shuffled into the kitchen, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the coffee pot. He tried to hide it, but the shaking grew worse in the mornings. Parkinson's was creeping in, slow but steady. Eve noticed, though she pretended not to, giving him the dignity of silence. At the couch, Ruby sat with her backpack, coloring quietly. The little girl's hair framed her pale face, her lips occasionally tinged blue. Eve kept a hand on her niece's shoulder, feeling the faint thump of a heartbeat that never seemed strong enough. Ruby had been born with a defect in her heart. Doctors at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota had been monitoring her, waiting for the right moment to operate. The surgery was costly, the weight unbearable. Every night, Eve lay awake doing the math in her head: rent, food, medication, gas. It never added up. That morning, the phone rang. Eve wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered, bracing for another collection call. But the voice on the line surprised her. "This is Whitaker Holdings. We'd like to schedule you for an interview tomorrow for the executive secretary position." Eve's knees went weak. She pressed the phone harder to her ear, repeating the words silently to herself. Executive Secretary, Whitaker Holdings. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago did. The company that controlled half the warehouses across the Midwest. Ann Garrett Whitaker, cold, brilliant, untouchable. She remembered the headlines, though she hadn't cared much for gossip. Her first thought wasn't about prestige. It was about the health insurance package that came with a corporate job. Comprehensive coverage, the kind that could mean the difference between Ruby waiting months in pain or being scheduled for surgery. Eve looked at her niece, who was humming softly over her coloring book. She thought of Hank, trying to lift his coffee mug without spilling. Then she thought of the storm on I-94, the way strangers had relied on her instructions. If she could hold together a line of frightened people in a blizzard, maybe she could manage the schedule of a powerful man. The interviewer gave her the details, and Eve wrote them down carefully on the back of a grocery flyer. 10, downtown headquarters. Bring resume. When she hung up, her heart was pounding with equal parts fear and determination. The snow outside still clogged the streets, and buses ran late. But none of that mattered. She would get there. She had to. Meanwhile, across the river in his glass-walled office, Garrett reviewed reports while his PR director spoke at length about optics. "Harrington wants reassurance," the director said. "You need a consistent presence, a partner, or at least a companion, at public events, someone respectable, someone steady." Garrett stared past the man's shoulder, out the window at the gray river flowing sluggishly between ice. The word steady rang in his mind again. He thought of the woman on I-94, her voice commanding in the storm, her arms shielding a fragile child. He didn't know her name, but in the silent glass tower, her image rose again, warmer than any of the sterile advice his team offered. Later that night, as lights across the city flickered on, Eve sat at her worn kitchen table, copying directions to the interview onto a note card. She checked the bus schedule twice. She ironed the one good blouse she owned, careful to press the collar straight. The snow still lay heavy on the sidewalks. The cold still pressed in through the thin walls. But in Eve's mind, a door had cracked open, and behind it glowed the faint, steady light of hope. By the time she turned off the lamp, Ruby was asleep under her quilt, Hank's harmonica resting silent on the shelf, and Eve's heart beat with a quiet resolve. Across the city, Garrett sat alone by the tall windows of his penthouse. He held a glass of scotch untouched in his hand, the city lights reflecting off the river. The blanket from the storm still rested in the corner of his chair. He hadn't let anyone take it away. As snow fell again, softer now, Garrett asked himself the question he couldn't silence. What would stability look like if it weren't measured in headlines? The answer, he sensed, was closer than he realized. The glass tower of Whitaker Holdings shimmered under a pale winter sun. Its lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and fresh coffee, a place designed to impress and intimidate. Evelyn Harper walked through its revolving doors with her resume clutched tightly in her gloved hands. She had pressed her one good blouse until it was smooth, even if the fabric was thinning at the seams. Her boots carried a trace of melted snow, and she hoped no one would notice. In the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Her posture was straight, her jaw firm, but her heart pounded like a drum. She thought of Ruby's fragile heartbeat, of Hank's trembling hands. She whispered to herself, "You're not here for yourself. You're here for them." The 22nd floor opened into a hallway of glass and steel. A receptionist ushered her into a waiting room where the city stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Eve's eyes drifted to the skyline, but she quickly pulled her attention back. She rehearsed answers in her head: strengths, weaknesses, why she wanted the job. When her name was called, she entered a conference room bright with winter light. Garrett Whitaker was already there, flanked by two members of HR. He looked exactly as the newspapers had described him: tall, impeccably dressed, a presence that commanded the space. Yet his expression was unreadable, as if nothing in the world could surprise him. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice even, "Please, have a seat." Eve lowered herself into the chair across from him. She folded her hands in her lap, steadying her nerves. The questions began. At first, they were the usual one skills, previous experience, why she had left her last job. Eve answered with precision, drawing on years of juggling paperwork, schedules, and crises at her former company. But when Garrett himself leaned forward, his questions shifted. What would you say defines your work ethic? Eve didn't flinch. Consistency, respect. "I believe in doing what I say I'll do, and I expect the same from those around me." His brow lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. "And how do you handle difficult personalities?" he asked, the corner of his mouth twitching with irony. "I set boundaries," she replied calmly. "People will test them, but if you hold steady, they learn where the line is." The HR managers exchanged glances. Garrett's gaze lingered on her, cool but curious. When the interview concluded, HR thanked her politely and explained they had other candidates. But Garrett spoke before they could dismiss her. "I'd like to make a decision now," he said. "Ms. Harper, you'll serve directly as my executive secretary. Report to me starting tomorrow." Eve's breath caught. Relief washed through her chest, followed quickly by resolve. She thought of Ruby's medical file, of Hank's shaking hand. This job wasn't simply employment, it was survival. But she wasn't finished. "There's something I need to make clear," Eve said, straightening her back. The HR managers froze, surprised at her tone. "I will do this job with everything I have, but my duties must remain professional. My hours, my responsibilities defined by the role. I won't blur the line between work and anything else." Silence stretched. It was the kind of statement that could cost her the offer, yet she didn't look away. To her surprise, Garrett didn't seem offended. Instead, his lips curved, almost imperceptibly. "Understood," he said. His voice held no mockery. If anything, there was a trace of admiration. The HR managers hurriedly drafted the offer. A stack of papers was slid across the table. Employment agreement, confidentiality clauses, benefits. Eve's hand shook slightly as she signed her name. She tried not to think about how this ink on paper could mean the difference between Ruby getting a chance at surgery or not. As she flipped through the final page, she noticed a small appendix attached. Travel obligations, required attendance at corporate events, fundraisers, community galas. Her eyes narrowed. The words were vague, but clear enough she would be expected to accompany Garrett into public settings. Any questions one HR officer asked lightly. Eve glanced up, her brow tight. "I'll attend events as required, but I expect my role to be professional. I won't be a prop." The officer shifted uncomfortably. Garrett's gaze held hers steadily. "Noted," he said simply. By the time the meeting ended, Eve stepped into the cold Chicago air with the contract in her bag. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she felt taller, more certain. For the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders had eased, if only slightly. Later that evening, in his penthouse high above the city, Garrett sat with his PR director reviewing schedules. "Harrington Gala this weekend," the director reminded him. "Family-focused event. They'll expect to see someone at your side, someone who balances your reputation." Garrett tapped the armrest thoughtfully. His mind flickered to the woman in the storm, then to the same woman across the conference table. Boundaries, she had said. Clear lines. "Send her the itinerary," Garrett instructed. "She'll come with me." Across town, Eve sat at the kitchen table with her father's pill bottles lined neatly by the salt shaker. Ruby was curled under a quilt on the couch. Eve opened the email with trembling fingers. Harrington Gala, Milwaukee, black tie, attendance required. Her stomach clenched. She had stepped through the door, but ahead of her stretched a corridor lined with unknowns. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms together. She had taken the first step. She could take the next. In the quiet of her small apartment, she exhaled slowly, staring at the calendar pinned to the wall. Her eyes lingered on Saturday night. The future had begun, and with it, a path into a world she had never imagined. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the long boardroom table. Charts glowed on the screen at one end of the room, red and green bars marching up and down. The air carried the sharp scent of fresh markers and the metallic tang of coffee that had sat too long on a hot plate. Eve sat quietly near the corner, pen poised over her notebook. She had been on the job less than a week, but she had already learned that silence revealed more than speaking. Her eyes tracked every exchange, every grimace, every sidelong glance. Mason Reed, the chief operating officer, leaned back in his chair with the swagger of a man who believed numbers excused everything. When a safety officer cleared his throat and pointed to a series of red flags on the chart injuries logged at a Joliet warehouse, Mason waved it away with a laugh. "Minor scrapes," Mason said. "If we shut down for every stubbed toe, we'd never ship a crate." A ripple of uneasy chuckles ran around the table. Eve's hand tightened on her pen. She looked down quickly, forcing her expression into neutrality, but inside, anger burned. She remembered the way Garrett had helped at the highway accident, the way people depended on steady hands in a crisis. To dismiss workers' safety like that, it grated against every value she carried. Garrett said nothing at first. His eyes stayed on the chart, his face unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze flicked to Eve. She hadn't realized she'd drawn in a sharp breath until she saw him notice. He tilted his head slightly, as though weighing her reaction. "Run the projections again," Garrett said finally, his voice cool but decisive. "If safety indicators keep trending red, we'll halt operations. I won't put people at risk." Mason's smile faltered, though he covered it with another dismissive wave. The meeting moved on, but Eve caught the flicker of irritation in Mason's eyes. By the time the session ended, Eve's notebook was filled with tidy bullet points, observations, and small sketches of body language. She had seen this culture before, profits pressed like weights against the backs of tired workers. But she had also seen Garrett push back, however briefly, against the tide. It planted a seed of reluctant respect. That evening, they prepared for the Harrington Gala in Milwaukee. Eve's fingers trembled slightly as she zipped the borrowed dress she had found at a consignment shop. In the hotel mirror, she barely recognized herself. The gown was simple, navy blue with a modest neckline, but it fit well enough. She brushed her hair back, pinned it, and told herself she belonged downstairs. Garrett adjusted his cufflinks in silence. When their eyes met, there was no smirk, no appraisal, only a short nod, an acknowledgement that tonight they would be seen together. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, every table draped in white linen and set with crystal glasses. The murmur of old money filled the air rail executives, politicians, philanthropists. Garrett moved easily among them, his handshake firm, his smile measured. Eve stayed close but not intrusive, keeping her role clear. She reminded herself of the boundaries she had set, even as flashes of cameras followed them. At one point, Garrett excused himself to take a call. Eve found herself standing near the dessert table, the scent of chocolate and champagne mingling in the air. Her phone buzzed. It was a video call from Ruby. Eve stepped into a quiet corner and answered. Ruby's small face filled the screen, eyes bright though her voice was weak. "Did you eat? Aunt Eve, Grandpa says you skipped dinner." Eve laughed softly, assuring her she was fine. As Ruby talked about school, a shadow fell across the screen. Garrett had returned. For a moment, He stood behind her, watching silently. When Ruby spotted him, she waved shyly. "Hi," she said in a small voice. Garrett's expression softened in a way Eve hadn't seen before. "Hello, Ruby," he said gently. "Take care of your aunt for me, will you?" When the call ended, Eve tucked the phone away, her throat tight. She hadn't expected him to be kind. It unsettled her. But the evening shifted when Veronica Hale appeared. She swept into the room like a storm draped in silk, her dress crimson, her smile sharp. Cameras swiveled instinctively toward her. She spotted Garrett across the crowd, then let her gaze slide deliberately to Eve. Her lips curved into a knowing smirk. The photographers were quick. As Garrett and Eve stood shoulder to shoulder, a dozen flashes went off. Eve felt the heat of the bulbs, the closeness of the crowd. Veronica lingered just within sight, her eyes gleaming with mischief as the cameras captured angle after angle. Eve held her chin high, refusing to fidget. She reminded herself she was not a prop, no matter what the tabloids would make of these photos tomorrow. Still, when Veronica's smile widened, Eve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter outside. It was the smile of someone who had just lit a fuse. As the night wore on, Eve caught that smile again, hovering near the edge of the ballroom. It was a warning, and it wrapped around her like cold steel. Something was coming. She could feel it. The ballroom had emptied, leaving only the muffled echoes of footsteps and the faint scent of champagne lingering in the air. Outside, Milwaukee's winter pressed against the tall glass windows, but inside, the heat of the evening still clung to the walls. Eve followed Garrett toward the elevators, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Around them, silence stretched, broken only by the hum of distant machinery. The grand hallway felt like a library after hours solemn, expectant. At the far end, Chuck Harrington lingered near the cloakroom, speaking with an aide. He glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of Garrett kneeling slightly, holding Eve's phone as Ruby's face glowed across the screen. Eve had called Ruby to say goodnight. She hadn't expected Garrett to kneel beside her, listening patiently as Ruby recited a prayer she'd learned at school. But there he was, his sharp features softened by the tiny child's voice, his smile faint but genuine. Chuck's brows rose. It was a look Eve couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part recognition that beneath Garrett's business armor was a man still capable of tenderness. Then Chuck slipped out quietly, leaving them alone. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Garrett gestured for Eve to enter first, but once the doors closed, the stillness grew heavy. They rode in silence, floor numbers glowing one by one. When the doors slid open to the hotel corridor, they stepped into a hush so deep Eve could hear her own breathing. Plush carpet muffled their footsteps. Chandeliers dimmed for the night cast golden pools of light along the walls. Garrett stopped halfway down the hall. Eve turned, uncertain. His expression was difficult to read. Something unguarded flickered in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in the boardroom or the ballroom. "You shouldn't have to carry this alone," he said finally, his voice low. "Ruby's surgery, the bills, I can help." The words struck Eve like a blow. She straightened, clutching her clutch bag tighter. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but that isn't your responsibility. It could be," he pressed gently. "One wire transfer and you wouldn't have to lose sleep wondering how you'll manage." Eve shook her head. "And what would that make me? A debt on your balance sheet, a name tied to your charity." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. She had fought too hard to stand on her own 2 feet, and she would not let gratitude be twisted into obligation. Garrett's jaw tightened. For a moment, frustration crossed his face, but then it softened into something more vulnerable. He stepped closer, close enough that Eve could see the fine lines of weariness etched near his eyes. "You've been steady since the moment I met you," he murmured, "even in a storm. You didn't falter." "You remind me what I—" He broke off, his voice caught between confession and restraint. Eve's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. The weight of the evening, the exhaustion of travel, the emotions stirred by Ruby's call, they all pressed in at once. Then, almost without conscious choice. Garrett leaned down, closing the distance. His breath brushed her cheek, the faint scent of cologne mixing with the warmth of champagne and winter air. His lips were inches away. Time slowed. Eve's heart lurched, but not with longing, with alarm. She stepped back sharply, heels pressing into the carpet. Her hand came up not to strike, but to create space. "No," she said firmly. The word was not angry, but resolute. "That's not part of this. I told you where the lines are." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of their breathing. Garrett froze, then straightened slowly. A shadow crossed his face, pride and disappointment warring inside him. For Eve, the moment was both terrifying and clarifying. She respected him as her employer. She admired his instincts when he chose decency over profit. But this she could not allow. She would not let her integrity be blurred by fatigue or gratitude. The tension hung between them like a drawn curtain. Then Garrett exhaled, a long, quiet sound. "Understood," he said. His tone carried no mockery, no anger, only acknowledgement. They walked the remaining distance in silence. The elevator's ding still echoed faintly in Eve's ears, as though marking the line she had drawn. When she reached her room, she closed the door softly behind her, pressing her palms against the wood. Her chest still raced, her cheeks still burned. She replayed the moment, reminding herself she had done the right thing. She had to. Across the hall, Garrett stood by his own door, phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, scanning the new message. His face darkened. Joliet warehouse gas leak detected. Mason recommends keeping operations running to meet quotas. High risk of shutdown if reported. Garrett's thumb hovered over the screen. The night's rejection still echoed inside him, a sting sharper than he cared to admit. Yet now, another decision pressed hard against him. Money versus safety. Loyalty versus truth. The carpeted hallway was quiet, but inside both rooms, storms gathered, and before the night was over, one of those storms would break. The antiseptic smell hit Eve the moment she stepped through the sliding doors. It clung to her skin, sterile and cold, mixed with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Monitors beeped steadily down the corridor, their rhythm slicing the silence into jagged pieces. Ruby lay in the hospital bed, a child far too small for the wires attached to her chest. Her lips carried a bluish tint, her breathing shallow. Eve sat close, fingers wrapped tightly around the girl's small hand. Her own lips moved in silent prayers, words she didn't speak aloud, but whispered into the corners of her heart. Across the city, only hours earlier, her phone had vibrated with an urgent alert. A red risk flagged on her safety dashboard: gas leak. Joliet warehouse. She had hesitated only long enough to breathe, then forwarded the report directly to Garrett with one short message. Lives at risk. Shut it down. Now, in this room. She wondered if he had listened. The door opened softly. Garrett entered, his usual tailored confidence muted by the sharp hospital air. His coat hung open, his tie loosened. In his hand was his phone, screen still glowing with messages from Mason. But Garrett's expression told Eve everything. "I closed it," he said quietly. "Joliet is shut down. Mason's furious. Losses will sting. But no one's going back in until it's safe." Relief swelled inside her, though it mingled with exhaustion. She nodded once, then turned back to Ruby. The child stirred faintly, her lashes fluttering. Eve smoothed the quilt over her chest, fighting the fear that had gnawed her for months. Hank entered next, his shoulders stooped, his hand trembling more than usual as he tried to carry a small overnight bag. Eve rose quickly, taking it from him before the tremor grew worse. "I've got it." "Dad," she murmured. His eyes, tired and damp, lingered on Ruby. She looked so small. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat roughly, trying to hide the break. Eve put a hand on his arm, steadying him. "She's stronger than she looks. We'll get her through this." Hank sank into the chair near the window. His hand pressed against his thigh to still the tremors. He tried to sign a form a nurse handed him, but the pen shook so badly Eve gently slid it from his fingers. "I'll take care of it," she said softly. "Rest." So she signed page after page, consent forms, insurance acknowledgments, emergency contacts, her name scrawled across line after line, her resolve holding steady even as her stomach twisted. Garrett stayed, but at a respectful distance. He didn't try to insert himself into the family circle. Instead, he handled quiet tasks, the vending machine snacks, the fresh cups of water, the small details that might otherwise break Eve's fragile focus. Hours dragged on. The night deepened outside the windows, the city lights blurred by frost. In the waiting room, Eve finally sat, her body heavy with exhaustion. Garrett lowered himself into the chair beside her. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," he said. She didn't answer. Her eyes were on the floor, the scuffed tiles, the way the fluorescent lights reflected like pale moons. "I want to help," Garrett continued, his voice softer. "Not just with checks or contracts, with presence, with standing beside you." Eve's chest ached. For a moment, the image of leaning into him, letting someone else shoulder the weight, tempted her. Her body longed for rest, her heart for comfort. But then Ruby's monitor beeped faintly down the hall, reminding her why she couldn't blur those lines. She turned to him, her face weary but firm. "No," she said gently. "Not now. Ruby comes first. Always." Her rejection wasn't sharp, but it landed with finality. Garrett inhaled slowly, then leaned back, nodding once. He accepted it, though his eyes betrayed the sting. Silence returned, filled only by the creak of plastic chairs and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. Eve folded her arms around herself, drawing strength from the only truth she could cling to, that her niece needed her whole. Minutes later, Garrett's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his brows knitting. Another message from Harrington's office. "If Whitaker Holdings wants to keep our partnership, your company must prove safety is your top priority. Publicly, no more silence." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tightening. The weight of two worlds pressed on him, the empire he'd built and the fragile girl sleeping down the hall. Eve noticed his stillness, but didn't pry. She was too drained, too focused on Ruby's shallow breaths. The night wore on, the waiting room sinking into the strange timelessness of hospitals. Eve's head eventually rested against the chair back, her eyelids heavy. Garrett sat near her, his posture rigid, his thoughts spinning like gears. He didn't reach for her again. He simply kept watch, as though standing guard. When dawn finally touched the frost outside, a nurse stepped in to update them. Ruby was stable for the moment, but surgery would be scheduled soon. Eve exhaled, her body trembling with the release of held breath. Beside her, Garrett's phone vibrated again. The message glowed like a warning flare. Harrington Rail was demanding a public stance. If he faltered, everything could collapse. The storm inside him matched the storm in Eve's chest. And though neither said it aloud, both knew the days ahead would test them more than this long night. Morning light spilled across the city, but it carried no warmth. On breakfast tables, in office lobbies, and across glowing phone screens, one headline screamed louder than the rest. Secretary Saducee's CEO, Whitaker's new flame. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Garrett and Eve stood side by side at the Milwaukee Gala, their shoulders brushing, the angle captured to suggest intimacy. The article spared no cruelty. Words like climber and calculated dripped from every line. Eve's phone buzzed endlessly on the kitchen counter. Each notification stung social media comments, co-workers forwarding links, even strangers finding her personal email. She sat at the small table in her South Side apartment, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Hank shuffled in, newspaper tucked beneath his arm. He dropped it on the table, the front page folded to the damning photo. "Evelyn!" His voice trembled. His Parkinson's tremor was worse this morning, but the real shake came from guilt. "If I weren't such a burden, Maybe you wouldn't stop. Eve cut in firmly, though her throat was tight. This isn't about you. And it isn't true. Ruby patted in, her slippers dragging. She climbed onto the chair beside Eve, her little hands clutching the edge of the table. "Aunt Eve," she asked softly, "are you going to lose your job?" The words pierced deeper than any headline. Eve swallowed hard, brushing a hand through Ruby's hair. "No, sweetheart, I won't let that happen." But inside, she wasn't so sure. Across town, Garrett stood in front of the towering windows of his office. The city spread like a frozen map below. His PR team crowded around, each voice competing to be heard. "You must release a statement, immediately distance yourself. Say nothing personal happened. Blame the angle of the photo or ignore it. Scandals burn out faster when you don't feed them." Garrett's jaw clenched. He tuned them out, his mind replaying the image of Eve holding Ruby's hand in the hospital. How could he reduce her to a disposable line in a press release? He knew Veronica's hand was in this. The timing was too sharp, the smear too practiced. She had always been skilled at planting seeds of doubt. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't PR chatter. It was a flagged report from internal audit. He opened it, scanning quickly, his eyes narrowed. Warehouse safety budget, Q4 undocumented cuts, contractor substitutions, Mason Reed approval signature. The words leapt off the page. It wasn't just sloppy accounting, it was negligence, the kind that risked lives. His stomach twisted. The gas leak at Joliet wasn't a fluke. It was the direct result of corners Mason had sliced. Garrett sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. If this got out, Harrington Rail would walk away. The board would revolt. Investors would flee. And yet, the thought that struck hardest was not financial. It was the image of those workers in the storm, shivering in their cars, of Ruby in her hospital bed, of Eve standing against the tide with nothing but her will. The door to his office opened quietly. Eve stepped in, clutching a manila folder to her chest. Her shoulders were straight, but her hand trembled slightly against the paper. "I need to show you something," she said. Garrett rose slowly, his eyes meeting hers. She crossed the room and laid the folder on his desk. Inside were printouts of accounting sheets, copies of emails, signatures in Mason's bold scrawl. "I didn't go looking for this," she said. "It came across my desk this morning. And if it's true, then what happened in Joliet wasn't an accident. It was a cost-cutting game." Her voice wavered, but her eyes were steady. Garrett flipped through the pages, the weight of each line pressing harder. He knew instantly she was right. Mason had gambled with human lives to inflate quarterly margins. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the city outside the glass. Finally, Eve drew a slow breath. "I don't care what people write about me. They can call me names, say whatever they want. But if you let this slide, if you let him get away with this," she shook her head, "then none of us deserve to stand in front of Harrington or anyone else." Garrett studied her. The scandal swirled around them, threatening to devour reputations and deals. But standing in his office was a woman who had more to lose than anyone and still chose truth over safety. Her hand shook as she pushed the folder closer. "Do the right thing," she said quietly. For the first time in years, Garrett felt a strange sensation rising in his chest. Not fear, not ambition, but a raw urgency to measure up to the courage standing before him. Eve turned toward the door, pausing only once. Her hands were still trembling, but her eyes were steady as steel. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about integrity, and she was willing to risk everything to see it through. The press conference room was packed wall to wall, cameras perched like watchful eyes, microphones clustered on the podium. Heat from the lights bore down, making the air heavy despite the winter chill outside. Garrett Whitaker stepped to the stand, his expression set, his shoulders squared. His suit was immaculate, but a faint crease near the cuff betrayed how little he had slept. Dozens of lenses zoomed in, eager for one slip, one sound bite that could be twisted. Eve stood off to the side, pressed against the wall, her breath shallow. She could feel the tension ripple across the crowd like static. Everyone was waiting: investors, reporters, workers, the Harrington family. One wrong word, and everything he had built would unravel. A reporter shouted first, "Mr. Whitaker, is it true your COO authorized cost cuts that led to a gas leak in Joliet?" Another cut in before he could answer. "And what about the photographs of you and your secretary? Are they proof you've been distracted from your duties?" Garrett raised a hand. The room stilled. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. There was negligence. Yes. A murmur swept through the crowd. An internal review has confirmed that safety budgets were cut without authorization. I take responsibility as CEO. Effective immediately. Mason Reed is suspended, pending full investigation. Flashes exploded across the room. Eve's throat tightened. No corporate leader admitted fault so directly. Not with billions at stake. Garrett pressed on. Operations at Joliet will remain closed until independent inspectors clear the site. Whitaker Holdings will fully compensate any worker harmed, and we are establishing an outside audit of all safety practices company-wide. This company cannot afford profits built on the backs of people we fail to protect. The words echoed, heavy and unvarnished. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Others exchanged skeptical looks. A few shook their heads, muttering that he had doomed himself. But near the back of the room, Charles Harrington leaned toward his aide. His expression, often stern, carried a flicker of respect. He had seen many men dodge accountability. Few faced it head-on. When the questions ended, Garrett stepped down, the weight of silence trailing him. Eve caught his eye for a brief moment as he passed. He gave nothing away, but she could read the exhaustion in the lines of his face. That night, the noise of the city faded behind them. Instead of retreating to his penthouse or her small apartment, Garrett drove them both to a community kitchen on the south side. Volunteers were short-staffed, and the chaos of clattering pans and steaming pots felt grounding after the storm of cameras. Eve rolled up her sleeves, tying an apron around her waist. She ladled soup into bowls, the steam fogging her glasses. Garrett stood beside her at the sink, sleeves pushed up, rinsing heavy pots under scalding water. For a man who usually signed papers with a fountain pen, his hands moved surely, uncomplaining. They didn't talk much. The clang of dishes and the laughter of children at the long tables filled the silence. Yet, there was something in the simplicity of it, two people working side by side, that softened the sharp edges of the day. When the last dish was stacked and the room had quieted, they lingered by the sink, the fluorescent light humming overhead. Eve leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her body heavy with fatigue but lighter in spirit. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Garrett glanced at her. "Do what?" "Tell the truth. Risk everything. Most men in your position would have buried it." He shrugged, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of vulnerability. "You showed me what burying costs. On I-94. In that hospital. It wasn't courage, it was the only choice left." Their eyes met. The space between them charged. The exhaustion, the shared battles, the glimpse of humanity in one another, it pulled them closer. Without thinking, Garrett leaned in, his hand brushing the edge of the counter near hers. His breath mingled with hers, the scent of soap and faint cologne clinging to him. For one heartbeat, Eve almost let herself sink into it. Almost. Then Ruby's face flashed in her mind, her small body beneath hospital blankets. Her fragile smile. Eve pulled back gently but firmly. "No," she said softly. "Not like this. Not in the middle of everything crashing down." Garrett froze, then straightened slowly. The sting was visible, but he didn't argue. He stepped back, giving her space. The kitchen returned to silence, save for the drip of a faucet. Eve turned, wiping her hands on her apron, steadying her breath. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, eyes scanning the message. Her chest tightened. Mayo Clinic, Ruby Harper, scheduled for surgery. Arrival required within 72 hours. The weight of the words sank deep. She closed her eyes. whispering a thank you she wasn't sure was to God or to fate. When she opened them, Garrett was watching her carefully. She didn't tell him what the message said, not yet, but the path ahead had just narrowed sharply, and the countdown had begun. The interstate stretched ahead like a ribbon of ice, the snowbanks on either side stacked high from weeks of storms. Headlights cut narrow tunnels of light through the Midwestern night, and the heater inside Garrett's SUV hummed steadily. In the back seat, Ruby was wrapped in a quilt, her small body curled like a bird in its nest. Her head leaned against Eve's shoulder, her breath shallow but even, a faint whistle with each exhale. Eve stroked her hair absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on the blur of white fields beyond the window. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It carried the weight of worry, the kind that hummed beneath every mile marker. At a rest stop outside Madison, they pulled in for fuel. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a tired glow on the snow-streaked pavement. Inside the small diner attached to the station, the air smelled of fried potatoes and overbrewed coffee. Garrett ordered bowls of chicken noodle soup, the kind served in plastic cups with crackers wrapped in cellophane. Eve watched as he slid one across the table to her, then carefully set another in front of Ruby when the girl stirred awake. "I used to live on this stuff," Garrett said, spoon clinking against the cup. "When I was a kid, winters like this would knock the power out for days. My mom would heat soup on a hot plate, keep us wrapped in coats indoors." Eve looked up, surprised. Garrett rarely spoke of himself beyond business. His tone wasn't polished for effect. It was raw, unembellished. "Didn't think you'd ever gone without," she admitted. He gave a faint smile, one corner of his mouth tugging upward. "People see the tower. They don't see the trailer park before it." She studied him in that moment, seeing not the CEO who filled headlines, but a boy shivering in a dark kitchen, clutching a steaming cup while the wind howled outside. The image softened something in her chest, though she tried not to show it. Ruby sipped her soup quietly, then slipped her small glove back on, mismatched and worn. Garrett noticed the fraying threads and reached across to adjust the cuff gently. He said nothing, but Eve caught the look in his eyes, regret, maybe even guilt. Back on the road. The SUV moved steadily toward Rochester. The hum of tires on frozen asphalt lulled Ruby back to sleep. Eve leaned her head against the seat, her eyelids heavy, but she didn't let herself drift fully. She stayed half alert, attuned to every sound of Ruby's breathing. Hours passed. The clock crept past midnight when they reached the outskirts of the city. Streetlights glowed against the snow, guiding them toward the hospital campus. At the hotel across from Mayo Clinic, they checked in quietly. The lobby was warm, filled with the scent of pine from a small Christmas tree still standing in the corner. Eve led Ruby upstairs, tucked her into the bed, and smoothed the quilt over her. Hank arrived shortly after, slow but steady, determined to be near his granddaughter. When Ruby finally slept, Eve stepped into the hallway for air. Garrett followed a few minutes later, his coat thrown over his shoulders. The hallway was dim, lined with muted carpets and framed photos of winter scenes. "You've carried this alone for so long," he said gently. Eve leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "There wasn't anyone else to carry it. You could let me?" His voice was low, sincere. She turned, meeting his eyes. The distance between them felt charged, too close and too fragile all at once. He stepped nearer, not bold, but drawn by something he couldn't hold back. For a heartbeat, Eve wanted to let him. The temptation flickered of resting her head against his chest, of not being the only steady one for once. But then she thought of Ruby's surgery scheduled within hours, of the deal with Harrington still hanging, of the headlines still clawing at her name. "This isn't the moment," she said quietly, her breath visible in the cold draft from the window. "If you mean it, say it when the world is watching, not just here, not just now." It was the fourth rejection, but softer than the others. It wasn't born of anger, it was born of need. She needed proof, not impulse. Garrett's jaw worked, the words caught behind restraint. He stepped back slowly, nodding once, as though promising her the answer she sought. When they returned to the room, Eve checked her phone. A new message from Whitaker Holdings glowed on the screen. Her stomach dropped. Harrington contract signing, scheduled for Friday morning. 10 a.m., same time as Ruby's surgery. The walls seemed to close in, the hallway pressing tight. 2 events, 1 choice, and the weight of it loomed over them both, heavier than the snow outside. The hospital hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and brewed coffee from the vending machine. The floor clock ticked past 10 in the morning, the very hour Garrett was expected in a grand hotel ballroom downtown, surrounded by board members and flashing cameras. But he wasn't there. He stood instead in the children's wing, coat folded over his arm, eyes fixed on the double doors of the operating room. Eve sat a few chairs down, Ruby's stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her hands. Hank dozed lightly beside her, head nodding, the tremor in his hand resting at last. The tension in the corridor was thick, each minute stretching too long. Garrett's phone buzzed with frantic messages. The Harrington signing is starting. Where are you? Cameras are rolling. He typed a short reply and sent it to his team. You sign, handle the paperwork. I'm not leaving here. When he slid the phone back into his pocket, his shoulders seemed to drop. The decision was made. Moments later, reporters began to trickle into the hospital lobby, tipped off by whispers of where he had gone. The glare of camera lights once again pierced the sterile calm. Garrett didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice even, carrying through the microphones shoved toward him. This morning, I was scheduled to finalize a contract, he said. But some things are larger than business. Today, my focus is here with a child in surgery, and with the families who put their trust in us. The reporters leaned closer, hungry. Garrett continued, deliberate and unhurried. Whitaker Holdings is launching 2 funds. First, the Transportation Safety Fund to ensure every worker, every driver, every family touched by our industry is protected. And second, a pediatric heart surgery fund, named in honor of my mother, who taught me that strength is measured by how we guard the most vulnerable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. Eve, still seated, looked up, her throat tightening. She hadn't known he would do this. Down the hall, Charles Harrington arrived with his aide. The older man took in the scene, the microphones, the flash bulbs, the CEO choosing principle over convenience. Slowly, he nodded. Bring the documents here, Chuck said to his aide. If Whitaker is signing, he'll sign beside the people he claims to serve. Minutes later, the contracts were unfolded on a portable table in the hospital corridor. Reporters surged forward, capturing the surreal moment, 2 men in suits, pens in hand, beside vending machines and plastic chairs. Harrington scrawled his name first, then gestured to Garrett. Integrity doesn't wait for banquet halls, he said, loud enough for the cameras. It's right here. Eve felt her chest swell, though she tried to remain composed. She tightened her grip on Ruby's rabbit, holding it as if the small toy could anchor her. But Veronica wasn't finished. She appeared near the back of the crowd, her crimson coat a flare of color in the sterile hallway. With practiced ease, she raised her voice so the microphones caught every word. So, this is what it takes, she said, smiling coldly, parading a secretary as your moral compass, convenient. Until the tabloids find another story. The air prickled with tension. All eyes flicked to Eve. Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin, refusing to shrink. Before Garrett could speak, Harrington's voice cut through the buzz. Enough. Veronica. I've watched long enough to know what matters here. His gaze shifted to Eve. Ms. Harper isn't a distraction. She's the backbone of this room. If Whitaker Holdings has her, they have a conscience. The crowd erupted with new flashes and hurried notes. Veronica's smirk faltered. She turned sharply and stalked out, the echo of her heels swallowed by the corridor. Garrett signed his name beside Harrington's, the pen stroke steady despite the storm of cameras. As soon as the final page was complete, he stepped back, the weight of weeks of battles finally settling. But at that moment, the double doors of the operating room opened, a surgeon emerged, mask lowered, eyes tired but kind. "She's stable," he said. "The procedure went smoothly. We'll monitor her closely, but the signs are good." The words washed over Eve like sunlight breaking through a blizzard. She clutched the rabbit tighter, tears blurring her vision. Hank exhaled a broken laugh, covering his face with his shaking hand. Garrett leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. Relief surged through him, stronger than any contract, deeper than any profit margin. The cameras still whirred, but for the first time he didn't hear them. He felt only the pounding of his own heart and the quiet gratitude filling the hallway. When the crowd finally dispersed, Garrett remained, shoulder pressed to the cool wall, his tie loosened, his breath slow and heavy. He watched Eve through the glass window as she bent over Ruby's bed, smoothing her niece's hair, whispering words only family could speak. He knew then the truth could not stay unsaid much longer. It was time to tell her what lived unspoken in his chest. Snow had stopped falling overnight. The hospital garden lay quiet, branches heavy with frost, benches dusted in white. The air carried a fragile stillness, the kind that followed storms. Garrett walked slowly across the path, his breath clouding in front of him. He was no longer dressed like the man on magazine covers. His coat was simple, his tie absent. In his hands he carried nothing but the weight of what he needed to say. Inside. Ruby was resting, her monitors steady. Eve had sat with her until dawn, whispering songs from childhood, smoothing her niece's hair until sleep came. Now, needing air. She had stepped outside. She looked up as Garrett approached. His eyes met hers, not guarded, not polished, but open. "I spoke with the board this morning," he began, voice steady. "I told them I'm stepping back from day-to-day control. They'll appoint a new CEO within weeks." Eve blinked, startled. "You're leaving?" "I'm shifting," he corrected softly. "I'll focus on the foundations we started yesterday, the safety fund and the heart surgery fund. That's where I belong now, not in boardrooms fighting for quarterly numbers." He drew a slow breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I recommended someone else to fill Mason's role. A woman from operations, quiet, principled, and relentless about safety. She's been overlooked for years because she doesn't play politics. She deserves the seat." Eve's lips parted slightly. For once, she couldn't find words. Garrett took another step closer. His voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of long suppressed truth. "I've lived most of my life afraid," he confessed. "Afraid of failing my company. Afraid of being seen as weak. Afraid of letting people close because I thought they'd leave." He paused, his hands flexing slightly at his sides. "With you, I learned something different. That courage isn't about standing taller than others. It's about standing beside someone when they need you most. You taught me that." Eve felt her chest tighten. She remembered each moment, the blizzard, the hospital nights, the boardroom battles. Through it all, he had changed. Not perfectly, not quickly, but undeniably. His voice roughened. "I love you, Eve. I don't say that lightly. I want to spend my life proving it, not with headlines, not with contracts, but with actions that hold when storms hit." Her throat ached. She wanted to believe him, and for the first time, she truly did. He leaned closer, not hurried, not demanding, but offering. The space between them narrowed. She felt his breath, warm against the cold air. This time, she didn't step back. Her eyes closed, and their lips met in a kiss that carried none of the haste of before. It was steady, certain the fifth attempt, the first she welcomed, a kiss not born of impulse, but of transformation. When they parted, Garrett's forehead rested lightly against hers. His breath was unsteady, his eyes damp. Eve's hands lingered at his chest. "This is different," she whispered. "It had to be," he replied. The garden remained still, as if even the winter air paused to hold the moment. Later that day, Charles Harrington arrived at the hospital again, papers in hand, but instead of contracts, he carried an invitation. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice warm, though his stature remained imposing. We could use someone like you on our community advisory council. Companies need more voices that speak for families, for workers, for truth. Will you consider it? Eve felt heat rise to her cheeks. She nodded slowly, her hand tightening around Ruby's rabbit she carried in her pocket. It wasn't the kind of power Garrett had once chased. It was quieter, deeper, the kind that shaped lives without fanfare. As evening fell, Garrett and Eve stood once more at Ruby's bedside. The child stirred, whispering her aunt's name, then drifted back into dreams. Garrett reached for Eve's hand, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. She let him hold it. Outside, the snow reflected the glow of hospital lights. For the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like a door, cracked open, waiting for them both to step through. The kitchen was warm, the kind of warmth that seeped deeper than the heater could provide. It came from the oven, where a roasted chicken glistened under a crust of butter and garlic. It came from the apple pie bubbling inside, the cinnamon filling the air. And it came from the laughter of a little girl whose heart beat stronger now than it ever had. Ruby sat at the table, her quilt still draped around her shoulders, a crayon in hand. She leaned over a sheet of paper, drawing uneven shapes that she proudly declared were houses, trees, and a sun bigger than the rest of the page. Every few minutes she giggled, her cheeks flushed with color. On the couch, Hank lifted a harmonica to his lips. The tremor in his hand made the notes wobble, but music still drifted into the air. It was broken, fragile, yet filled with warmth. Eve leaned against the counter, eyes damp, as she listened to her father fight through each sound. She glanced at the photo propped against the wall, Ruby after surgery, cheeks pale but smiling, hospital bracelet still on her wrist. Eve had slipped the picture into a simple wooden frame that afternoon. Beside it, she had placed another symbol, a reservation slip for a cabin by Lake Michigan, dated for summer, a promise to herself, to Ruby, to her father, that they would not just survive, but live. Garrett entered from the hallway, shaking the snow from his coat. He hung a yellow hard hat on a hook by the door. It wasn't for construction he had bought it as a quiet reminder. Every time he crossed that threshold, he wanted to remember safety was not just a policy. It was a vow. Eve watched him, her lips curving faintly. He no longer carried the weight of a CEO trying to impress shareholders. He carried groceries, or Ruby's backpack, or sometimes Hank's medicine bag. His shoulders looked different, not lighter, but truer. He moved to the stove, checking the chicken, basting it with practiced hands. Eve joined him, brushing her shoulder against his lightly as she reached for the kettle. Steam rose as she poured hot water into 2 mugs, the scent of chamomile spreading between them. Outside the window, Lake Michigan stretched in the distance, dark and steady under the night sky. The sound of cars drifted faintly from the avenue, muffled by the walls of their small home. It was a different world than glass towers and gala ballrooms, but it was enough. Ruby shuffled over, holding her drawing. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing to the figures she had drawn, 3 tall ones and 1 small. She tapped the smallest. "That's me, and that's Aunt Eve, and Grandpa, and you," she said. Looking up at Garrett, he crouched down, studying the paper as if it were a masterpiece. "That's a good likeness," he said solemnly. Ruby laughed, pleased. Eve watched, her heart swelling. She remembered the first night she had seen him, in the storm on I-94. She never could have imagined this scene, him crouched on her kitchen floor, admiring a child's crayon son. Dinner passed slowly, plates clinking, stories shared. Hank spoke of old fishing trips by the lake, his voice halting but rich with memory. Ruby interrupted often, asking questions, her curiosity endless now that energy had returned to her body. Garrett listened more than he spoke, eyes steady, hands occasionally refilling cups or passing dishes. After the plates were cleared, Eve stood at the sink, washing while Garrett dried. It was simple, ordinary, and yet, after months of storms, the simplicity felt miraculous. "You're quiet tonight," Garrett said softly. Eve glanced at him, a small smile on her lips. Quiet feels good. He nodded, setting a clean plate on the rack. For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand filling. When the kitchen was done, they joined Hank and Ruby in the living room. Hank's harmonica rested on his lap now, his hands tired. Ruby curled against Eve, eyelids drooping. Garrett sat beside them, his hand resting lightly over Eve's, not claiming, not pressing, simply present. She turned her palm upward, threading her fingers through his. No contracts, no headlines, no ticking clocks. Only the warmth of a home, the rhythm of breath, the soft crackle of the oven cooling. Later that night, after Ruby was tucked in and Hank had gone to bed, Eve lingered by the framed photo on the shelf. She touched the edge of the glass, whispering a thank you into the quiet. Garrett joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. They stood together, looking at the picture, then at the slip for the summer cabin. Ready for the lake, he asked. Eve leaned into him, ready for what comes next. The night outside was still, but inside, life pulsed steady and sure. No grand finale, no applause, just the slow, steady choosing of each other, every day. And for the first time, that was more than enough. Life rarely unfolds the way we plan. Storms come sometimes as snow on a highway, sometimes as illness, or as betrayal from those we once trusted. Yet, in those storms, we discover who we truly are and who is willing to stand beside us. Garrett's journey reminds us that wealth and power mean little if they are not used to protect and uplift others. Integrity is not measured by quarterly profits, but by the courage to choose people over convenience, truth over silence. Eve's strength teaches us that dignity is not pride, it is knowing your worth, even when the world tries to diminish it. Their story reminds us that love does not appear in perfection, but in persistence, in showing up day after day with honesty and care. Sometimes rejection is not the end, but the refining fire that shapes something real. For those of us who have lived long enough to know loss, heartbreak, and healing, this tale is a gentle reminder it is never too late to choose love, to set boundaries, and to open our hearts when the time is right. The storms may shape us, but they do not have to define us. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, if you found hope or comfort in its words, we'd be grateful if you could support us. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe so that more souls can join us on this journey of healing and love. Until our next story, stay safe, stay kind, and keep shining.